Okay, we've had a ton of requests to do a deep dive on the Book of Enoch.
Mm.
And I got to say, it's a fascinating one. This book, it's not officially in the Bible for most denominations, right? But people are still drawn to it?
Yeah, it's a weird one.
Why do you think that is? What is it about this text that captures our imagination even centuries after it was written?
Well, I think the Book of Enoch kind of sits in this strange space, between what we consider accepted scripture and what's called apocryphal literature.
Okay, so to understand why it's so appealing, we need to define those terms a bit.
Yeah.
What are we really talking about when we say a book is canonical or apocryphal?
Right. So canonical basically means it's officially accepted as part of a religious group's core set of texts. There's scriptural tradition. For most of Christianity, Catholics, Protestants, they don't include the Book of Enoch. But then apocryphal, that usually refers to texts that didn't make that official cut, even though they're still important historically and religiously.
So it's like a book that almost made it into the big leagues, but ended up, on a historical waiting list, something like that.
Well, it's a bit more complicated, haha. The Book of Enoch was written, we think, sometime between 300 and 100 BC, so that puts it between the Old and New Testaments. And that period, we call it intertestamental, and the stuff written then, it shows this really complex mix of ideas, religious and cultural.
It sounds like a pretty exciting time, intellectually and spiritually. So what might have caused the book to get left out of the canon?
There are a bunch of theories. Some scholars think it's the imagery, how it talks about angels and giants and these cosmic journeys. It might have just been too much, too fantastical for some people to take literally.
Yeah, it definitely has a different feel than some of the more straightforward historical accounts in the Bible. A more mythological feel, I guess you could say.
Exactly. And as Christianity developed its own theology, the Book of Enoch might have seemed like it didn't quite fit in anymore, like it went off in its own direction from where things were headed.
That makes sense. Were there other factors, maybe even political or social things, that might have contributed?
It's possible, yeah. We know those things always play a role.
All right. Well, for now, let's stick with the content itself. What specifically in the Book of Enoch might have been seen as, too controversial back then?
One big one is how it portrays these fallen angels, called the Watchers, who get involved with humans and even father his race of giants.
Right. That story is actually rooted in Genesis, but the Book of Enoch really runs with it, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah. It goes into so much more detail, and that might have made some early church leader pretty uncomfortable.
Especially because it deals with those ideas of divine beings, doing forbidden things. Always a sensitive topic.
You said it. And the Book of Enoch, it doesn't hold back. It gets into all these descriptions of the afterlife, different cosmic realms, these really intense prophecies. It might have just been too far outside what was becoming the accepted interpretation of Scripture.
But even though most Christian denominations don't consider it part of the Bible now, it's still amazing to think that it was out there, influencing people back then.
Totally. And it's important to remember, not everyone rejected it. The Ethiopian and Eritrean Orthodox churches, which are some of the oldest Christian communities, it's still part of their canon.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
It just shows you the power of this book, how differently its message has landed across time and cultures.
For sure. And you can see the influence even in denominations that don't consider it canonical, like the apostles Jude and Peter. They both refer back to the book and its ideas in their own writing.
So even without that official canonical stamp of approval, it's undeniable how much of an impact it's had.
Exactly. It's this awesome example of a text that lives in this gray area, not officially in, but still woven into the fabric of religious history and thought.
It really makes you wonder about all the twists and turns in history, how something like this book can be so debated, so influential, and yet still kind of mysterious. And speaking of mysteries, we've been talking about the book, but what about the author? Who was this Enoch that the book is attributed to?
Yeah, Enoch, he's not just like a random name on a book cover. He's a pretty important figure in biblical tradition, even in the texts that are considered canon.
Oh, for sure.
He pops up in both the Old and New Testaments, and his family tree, that's where things get really interesting. Like, he's Noah's great-grandfather, part of that direct line from Adam.
Wow.
And get this, his son is Methuselah, the guy who supposedly lived to be over 900 years old.
Right. Talk about longevity. But Enoch, he's not just famous for his family, is he?
No, not at all. He's actually described as a prophet, someone who walked with God, received these incredible revelations. In fact, Jude, the apostle, he even quotes Enoch in his epistle.
Really?
Yeah, he talks about a prophecy from Enoch about God returning with his holy ones to judge, the righteous and the wicked.
Wow, that's quite the stamp of approval. Coming from such a prominent figure in early Christianity, it really shows how intertwined the Book of Enoch is with the development of Christian thought.
Absolutely, yeah. It's complex, and the book itself, it claims to be Enoch's own account, like firsthand, of all these wild experiences he had. Visions, prophecies, even a trip to heaven.
It's like something out of a movie, right? A man going to heaven, learning the secrets of the universe. So what were some of the things he supposedly saw and learned? What are the big takeaways from the book?
Well, one of the most well-known parts, and also the most controversial, is the story of the Watchers. This part, it expands on a really short passage you can find in Genesis about these sons of God who have children with human women.
Right, and that's where we get those stories about fallen angels and, of course, the giants. It's definitely one of the most enduring, captivating parts of the book.
It really captures the imagination, huh? This whole idea of these divine beings breaking the rules and then what happens afterward, the consequences. The Book of Enoch goes all in on the details, too. It names these watchers. It describes how they came down to earth on Mount Hermon, their interactions with these women. It gets pretty intense.
Almost like a forbidden romance, but with, like, cosmic consequences, right? What happens when you mix the divine and the human like that, according to the book?
Well, that's how you get the Nephilim, these giants who are said to have caused absolute chaos on Earth. The book describes them as huge, powerful, consuming everything in sight, and eventually they even turn on humanity.
It feels very much like a cautionary tale, a story about desire and, how things can go wrong when you don't follow the rules, divine or otherwise.
Exactly. The Nephilim, they're like a symbol of everything that happens when divine laws are broken. Corruption, violence, you name it. And it's their wickedness that finally makes God decide to just wipe the slate clean, leading to the Great Flood.
It's interesting how the Book of Enoch blends these different elements. It's got mythology, morality, even historical events woven in. It's not just a story about giants and floods, right? It's a reflection on good and evil, obedience and disobedience.
And that's what's resonated with people for centuries, those deeper themes. The book gives us a glimpse into this world where heaven and earth are super connected, where divine beings are walking around with humans, and the stakes, well, they're incredibly high.
Absolutely. But what about Enoch himself in all this? It's like he just vanishes from the story after he's taken up to heaven. What's up with that?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The book tells us that God took him up in a whirlwind, gave him this incredible tour of heaven, the cosmos, everything.
So he gets to peek behind the curtain and see what's really going on, right?
Exactly. And the text makes it seem like Enoch is changed by this, like he becomes this link between the divine and human worlds.
Like a go-between, a translator almost.
Yeah, you could say that. But his ultimate fate, it's left open. We don't really know what happens to him.
Like he ascends beyond the story itself. It just adds to the mystery of it all.
For sure. And that sense of mystery, that combination of history, mythology, spiritual insights, that's what makes the Book of Enoch such a fascinating, enduring text, even today. It sparks curiosity, makes you question what you thought you knew, see the world in a new way.
What's wild, right? The Watchers, the Nephilim, Enoch's just taking off to heaven. I could see why people are still so drawn to this book. But it's more than just the story itself, isn't it? The way it still gets people debating, coming up with new interpretations, even now.
Oh, absolutely. It's like the Book of Enoch. It kind of holds up this mirror. It shows us how we view the past, how we think about, the nature of reality. Some people even bring it up when they're talking about aliens.
Speaking of, I've heard about that, the whole ancient astronaut theory. What's your take on that?
Well, you know me. I always like to keep an open mind. With the ancient astronaut idea, they look at the Watchers not as angels, but as these extraterrestrial beings who landed on Earth way back when. They point to how the Book of Enoch talks about the Watchers teaching humans things like metalworking, how to make weapons, astronomy, stuff that seems way ahead of its time.
Right, like how could people back then have known all that? It's definitely food for thought.
It definitely makes you think. But even if we don't go down that road, the ancient astronaut theory, the Book of Enoch, still raises some big questions, like how did people share knowledge back then? How did religious beliefs evolve? And what makes a text official or not,
It's true. Every time we think we've got a handle on the Book of Enoch, it's like, bam, more questions. Like, if it wasn't accepted into the Bible by most Christian groups, why was it so influential with early Christians? I mean, figures like Jude and Peter, they were quoting from it. Why do you think it resonated so much?
It's a really good question. One possibility is that the Book of Enoch just fleshed things out more. It offered a bigger picture of the cosmos, a more in-depth look at the spiritual world compared to what was in the Hebrew scriptures at the time.
So it was like filling in the blanks, giving people a framework for understanding these bigger concepts, the unseen world. Makes sense, especially for those early Christians who were really searching for deeper meaning.
Right. And don't forget the Book of Enoch, it talks a lot about a coming Messiah, a son of man who would judge everyone and set up God's kingdom.
Ah, okay, so those ideas about a Messiah, they were already circulating well before Jesus.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder how those ideas, those prophecies, might have influenced how early Christians thought about Jesus, about their beliefs.
That's like this whole web of ideas, religious and cultural, all swirling around back then. The Book of Enoch might not have made it into the official biblical canon, but it definitely left its mark on the early Christian world.
It's hard to deny. It really makes you question everything you thought you knew about history, about spirituality, even about what it means to believe in something. It blurs the lines between myth and reality, history and prophecy. It pushes us to ask bigger, more challenging questions.
It definitely keeps you on your toes. And that might be the most important thing about it in the end. It reminds us that we're still learning, that history isn't set in stone, that there's always more than one way to see things. And those mysteries, those unanswered questions, those are the things that keep us curious, keep us exploring, keep us coming back for more. And that's what we try to do today in our deep dive into the Book of Enoch. Thanks for coming along for the ride.